Welcome to News and Opinion, a panel about news and opinion and the blurring lines between them. So let me start with a quick overview of what I find most interesting about news and opinion. So way back at the beginning of this century, I was a regular reader of the New York Times columnists and opinion writers. The 2 pages at the back of that section were kind of, in a sense, the source of authority, a place where you could go to have the events of the world explained to you. And that changed for me when the New York Times first tried to adapt to the terrifying power of the internet by putting up a paywall. What they did is they put up the paywall that only covered their opinion writers. It was the most valuable part of the paper, kind of the most influential part, and they figured people would be willing to pay for that. Now, I think it kind of, you can see how it made sense for an editor to do that in 2005, to take the most prestigious part of the paper and the place where their writers the most experience, adding the most value, and ask readers to pay for it. But it turned out to be a terrible mistake, I think. And opinion writing, it turns out, is abundant, and it's what the internet does best. And to some extent, the New York Times is weakest against the opinion. When they walled off their columnists and their op-eds, they were basically asking their readers to pay for the one thing that they had on offer that the internet arguably does better, providing opinions and analysis. And I don't think I was the only one that kind of, when the internet was, the opinion pages were walled off to me, I looked for alternatives, realized how wonderful they were, and kind of never went back. And now if I read a New York Times column, it's because it comes at me over Twitter or something else, or somebody mentions it in a blog post, but I very rarely go there as a destination. So what I find interesting about that is one of the many revolutions that the internet has brought about is it's turned what was once a prestige product into one of its most common commodities. So real reporting and deep investigations and old school narrative storytelling, those all take a lot of time and a lot of resources. For opinion writing, the barrier is almost nothing. All you need really is a keyboard, a browser to keep track of what's going on, and an ability to write, and preferably quickly. Then you add to that this hot take phenomenon, which is that if you want to get traffic, the best thing to do is to see what everybody else is writing about it and write a quick, often very shallow opinion piece about it and capture that kind of that part of the traffic, and that makes the market very, very, very crowded. So all that to say that the question I think that this begs for our panelists today, and one that I'd like to explore, is that, you know, given these competitive pressures, how does one find the time and the resources to create opinion journalism that stands apart from this very noisy background? And then as the web becomes an increasingly personal space where journalists interact with readers and Twitter and compose personal blogs, and there's competition from these opinion writers essentially rewriting facts often, is it still possible, and is it still economically possible, especially to draw a distinction between simple news and opinion writing? So I think we got a great panel today to handle that. I'll quickly introduce everybody, and then I'll have a question for everybody, and I may have a follow-up for either one or some. And then I'd like to have questions from the audience as soon as we can. So starting from the furthest away from me, Margaret Sullivan is the public editor at the New York Times. She has an amazing role in that she has a platform and an obligation to comment and often criticize the people that pay her. Next to her is Jonathan Stein. He's the managing editor at Project Syndicate. That's a publication that takes editorials and op-eds written by experts, policymakers, intellectuals, economists, Nobel laureates, and then syndicates it to some 500 papers around the world in 154 countries. Lucy Marcus is a professor of leadership and governance at the IE Business School. She's a board director at Atlantia. She's the CEO of Marcus Consulting, and she writes columns for the BBC, for Project Syndicate, and she still does, hosts a TV series for Reuters. And then Mathew Ingram was, until recently, a senior writer at GigaOM, and he's now a senior writer at Fortune magazine. But the truth is that he is a modern digital journalist, and so he's really his own brand in and of himself. And he writes about the evolution of media and the social web. So my first question, if I can find it, is for Margaret. And you ready?
Well, I think so. Hello.
You sure?
All right.
Now
So
I'm ready.
In an article in January, you discussed the tendency of the Times that personal opinion was creeping into news stories often, and there was a struggle about where the paper was where to draw that line, when it was appropriate, when it wasn't. Sometimes this opinion was a matter of tone or imagery. Sometimes it was a matter of just not making very clear that a piece was a commentary piece, not a straight news piece, but it was confusing readers and maybe not living up to the standards of objectivity that the Times holds itself to. So my question is to you is that I think it's fair to say that all news contains a point of view, whether it's in its choice of who you're talking to as a journalist. Do you include the opinions of a climate change denier when you're talking about climate change, to national perspectives? Al Jazeera covered the war in Iraq very differently from most American media, or to the very selection of what you're writing about. How many stories should a newspaper run about Hillary Clinton and Benghazi, for example? So the question I have is, why is it important to maintain this distinction, given that it's largely an artificial one? And then why not take advice of those who say that the best way to maintain credibility is to disclose biases and then write the news as you see it? What exactly is at stake?
Okay, well, there's a lot to unpack there, but I would say that I'm not actually a black and white zealot on this question. I think that there is actually quite a bit of room on the news side of the operation for interpretation, analysis, even a kind of opinion. It doesn't all have to be restricted to the editorial or the op-ed page. But I do think that in this world in which people are coming upon articles from the New York Times and other places in a disaggregated way, they're not seeing it in the context of where it is in the paper. They're not picking up the signals that might come with typography or an interesting logo or something that says this is a column. It's become more important than ever to try to clue the readers into what it is they're reading. Is this a news, is this a news analysis? Is this intended to be a news side column? What is this animal? The reason that I wrote the column that you just mentioned was that someone had written a sports column, and it had the little logo that said Sports of the Times. Now, you're supposed to know when you see Sports of the Times that means this is a column and we'll have opinion in it. And it sort of started out being newsy and then switched gears into a very strongly opinionated piece, and people were sort of like, what is this thing? Why are you doing this? So I think it's really important to be as transparent and as upfront with readers about what they're getting.
So, is this working? Yeah. So the default, I think, is that we should not pile on for each question, but we should also take advantage of the fact that there's four of you, and you all have interesting things to say. So if anybody has a response or a comment to a question that was asked and answered, go ahead. So would anybody like to weigh in on this one?
I would, yeah. I think Margaret's right that it is good to give people some signals in the newspaper in terms of design and sort of layout and where it appeared. You often got signals that showed you what it was, but I'm not convinced that it's that important. I think most of us can figure out after we read something or as we read something, is this the writer speaking? Is it reporting? I'm not actually convinced that distinction is as important as we think it is. So it used to matter a lot in newspapers. It used to matter that certain people wrote for this specific page, certain people wrote for this other page, some people were allowed to use the I pronoun, some people were allowed to inject themselves into it, others were not. Those distinctions, I think, are disappearing, and in some cases, that's actually good. How we negotiate that, the blurring of those lines, and how I think we're starting to discover that, and we're sort of figuring out how we deal with that. But I think the attempt to sort of artificially distinguish those things is we've lost that battle effectively.
Anybody else?
Well, I think that it also, this kind of blurring of the lines also reflects, the extent to which journalism is becoming, probably because of social media, much more personality-driven, and people, it's a personality who's writing these stories. Yeah. It's a person that we know, and we have an opinion about them, right? Whether they're credible or not. So as journalists sort of raise their own personal profile, I think that sort of naturally plays into this blurring.
I actually think that's one of the most powerful things about digital media, and particularly social media, is that personal aspect that you can, it's no longer a sort of faceless institution, you know, that is delivering this packaged product to you. It's a person, and that person has views, and they have biases, and they have conflicts, and they have bad days and good days, and those things filter into what they're writing. And I think the more that we're aware of that, the better.
I guess I'll just say one more thing about this, which is that I do think that it's important. I think that readers find it important, and I think it's important value to me that news stories, straight news stories, be written with a sense of fairness and impartiality. Yeah. I wouldn't be so quick to toss that out altogether. I know there's a lot of thought about we don't want to have the view from nowhere. Everybody's coming from somewhere. Everything's fine as long as you disclose it. But I still think that the journalist, as a sort of honest broker who isn't inserting himself or herself into every story, is a valuable thing.
Do you think that's under pressure?
What's that?
Do you think that's under pressure?
Under pressure? Sure, absolutely it is. Yes, it is.
But I think fairness, I would agree, fairness is important. I think impartiality or total sort of even-handedness is not, those two things are very different.
I didn't say total even-handedness.
But I would say, as someone who writes opinion, I think about it a lot from the other perspective, which is when I write my pieces for Project Syndicate, I don't use I so much. It usually gets edited out, but I'm a very fine editor. But one of the things is that when I write pieces, I write three kinds of pieces. One are sort of thought pieces, sort of big thought pieces where I'm, the ones that I usually write for Project Syndicate actually, which are setting out new ideas, new ways of thinking about things, and putting things out there that I've conceptualized. The other is a sort of news analysis, and I feel that it's really important to use the I for that, and also for the last kind that I write, which is a sort of clip and save, where I talk about a sort of how to do something or an opinion on, how to work in the boardroom or something like that, because they're very much opinion, and I want people to understand that I'm not saying it's the truth, it's my truth, and I think it's really important to make that distinction, because you can disagree with it, that's absolutely fine. If it gets put out as a piece that this is how you should behave in this circumstance, then it needs to be known that that's not being written by a lawyer, or it's not legally binding, this is how you should behave, but rather it's how I think you should behave, and it's very much informed by my philosophy of how we approach, in my circumstance, business and the boardroom and so on. So I do think that for me, I'm very conscious of the fact that I'm writing opinion, and I need people to understand that it's my opinion, but someone else will have a counter way of looking at that.
I think, Stephan, you made a good point, which is that there is always a human being at the center of a news story. Mm-hmm. Someone wrote that story, and they chose to talk to certain people, and they selected certain quotes. They may even have deliberately talked to certain people and gotten them to say certain things that they agree with so that they could put them into a news story, because journalists do that. So there is always a person and their viewpoint in that story. It may be the editor, it may be the writer, but I think we need to acknowledge that and be more upfront about it.
So switching gears, Jonathan, you have been living, eating, breathing opinion journalism for
what does it taste like?
years now,
Since
7 days a week.
Century, I think. Yeah.
Tastes like sweat and tears. Yeah. 365 days a year. So every day you oversee the editing of, I should give a disclosure here, I also edit for Project Syndicate. But every day you oversee the editing of 2, 3, or 4, or 5 pieces, you put them online. All this opinion journalism is passing through your hands at a big pace. Right. So can you tell when a piece is going to elevate itself above the pack? And if so, what are the qualities that give an opinion piece that extra bit of added value?
Yeah, I mean, when I began with Project Syndicate, the idea was that we were sort of this hybrid academic media thing. So we have these Nobel laureates, we have Joe Stiglitz and Robert Schiller and Mike Spence and then people who haven't won a Nobel yet but may at some point. Yes, absolutely. Jeff Sachs and these types of people. Generally, what we find, it's very difficult sometimes to know when a piece is going to do well. Sometimes we think that a piece is great, and it just doesn't get any traction. And then sometimes a piece, I think, just sucks, and it blows up for some reason. But it very much depends on who the author is. A Stiglitz piece is always going to do well. A Jeff Sachs piece is always going to do well. A Bob Schiller piece is always going to do well. We had a piece by a guy in 2004. A friend of mine. I live in Prague, and he's sort of a drinking buddy. A dropout, really. He likes to hang out in bars, and he likes to teach English, and never got really a career going. And I was talking to him one night after the Abu Ghraib episode broke, and he was talking very knowledgeably about it. And he's sort of a long hair hippie type, and I said, how do you know so much about this? And he said, I was trained as an intelligence interrogator for the Army. And so I know all of this. And so I said, Mike, you really should write a piece for Project Syndicate. And he said, I don't know how to write. And I said, well, I'm going to interview you, and I'll write the piece, and we'll talk about it, and you'll put your name on it, and everything will be approved and above board. And we did that, and this piece just went completely, it was picked up everywhere in Europe and in the Middle East. It just went completely viral because it was his 15 minutes of fame. I mean, he was in the right place at the right time, and he had the right credential, right? And this is really what drives our sort of editorial policy. We don't. We get a lot of inquiries from journalists. We don't syndicate journalists. We syndicate people who are experts in their field. We sometimes syndicate journalists if they've written a book about the topic that they're addressing in the column. And this works very well with the editors of our member papers, 500 or so around the world, who are looking for commentary that they can't find anywhere else. And they trust us to find people who have the right credentials to write about that topic. But I like to think that we get it right more often than we get it wrong. I think that we do. We've been around for 20 years, so I think that we've succeeded on some level. But it doesn't happen every time. As I said, very often there are pieces that I think should really get a lot of attention that for whatever reason simply don't, and others that do that I think should have been buried.
Anybody else have any ideas on the secret formula?
No, but I certainly subscribe to this idea of the story or column that you think is going to be great and just rock the world, that falls like a stone into a deep, ocean, and the story that you don't really attach a lot of anything to that goes crazy. It's a principle of journalism I've never understood, but I want to.
Yeah, it's funny you should say, because we've talked about it, because I'll write something and I'll say, I will labor over some of these things I will not sleep nights. I will think about it constantly, because I write monthly for Project Syndicate, and I will labor over it, and then it will finally come out, and I'll think it's dreadful, and people will love it. It's just because you're so critical of yourself as well. Jonathan knows. I've stopped writing to him saying, this is a pile of steaming, you're going to hate it, because you're so self-deprecating about it. And then
I have a rule of thumb. If I work really long and hard on it and care a lot about it, it will sink without a stone, without a ripple. And
I agree.
if I dash it off, in half an hour, everyone will.
But the ones that do best, for me at least, are the ones that I feel most strongly about it. If I get really cross about something and it just goes out on the paper and there it is, somehow it always comes. The feeling somehow comes across, and I write better mad than happy. But
I think that's the distinction between sort of what Jonathan's talking about and you mentioning the hot take. Anyone can have a hot take. Anyone can come up with an opinion and dash something off about it. What I think people are looking for, whether they know it or not, is an informed opinion. Right. And so if you have some understanding or you have some experience or you have some knowledge that informs your opinion, it's always going to be better, even if you're not a very good writer. because as much as us English majors hate to admit it, people emotionally respond to what you're saying more than they do to the fancy words you use, I find.
Well, I mean, it's interesting too, because I was talking to a couple of the other Project Syndicate writers a couple months ago. A bunch of us were at the World Economic Forum, and we were lamenting the pressure of, if you're writing monthly and the expectation is to write something important each month, because if I send something that's pedestrian to Jonathan, he just won't take it. I mean, no, I mean, you won't. I mean, he'll send it back and say, you phoned this one in or something. You've not done that yet, but I know that for other people as well. I mean, the people I was talking to. So there's a huge pressure actually to say something important, but that expectation is really good. And if we had to write every day something profound, it wouldn't work. But if you feel that expectation, it makes you write better. And one of the reasons I love it is, I don't consider myself a journalist because I'm actually a practitioner. You talked about who writes for it. I sit on boards and I'm in the boardroom and I talk about and write about things that are self-critical in a way, about my peers. So you talk about criticizing the people who pay you. I mean, that's part of my remit as well. And so it's quite a fine line as well to write about the people that you work with or your peers every day, but also part of what I'm striving to do is change the world in which I exist, and so and change the world of business and how we look at it. So the pressure to write is strong, but it also means that you have to. It makes me think harder and work harder, and it's not something I could do every day. It takes me a month of sleepless nights and dreaming about it to finally sit down and write that piece. So
this is a good segue into my question for you. So you are an example of one of the new denizens of the information page that are displacing journalists and opinion writers.
Way to go, Liz.
Professional, yeah. So I mean, newspapers have always published opinion pieces by experts, but now you guys are here in ever greater numbers, and readers I think are much better for it. Because you're bringing, as we just talked about, the expertise, the point of view, the informed opinion. Now, the question I have is, why are you guys here? What's in it for you?
Well, I mean, here's the thing. I mean, I don't. There's a whole body of people who write stuff. I mean, anybody you can write on LinkedIn, which I like writing on LinkedIn, but the things I write on LinkedIn are completely different than the things I write for Project Syndicate. And I think when I was invited to become a monthly columnist of Project Syndicate, that was really important to me, actually, because that meant something to me, because the other people who write are people I admire. So, if you're writing monthly alongside, Joe Stiglitz or Nora Robini or, Laura Tyson or, all the other people who are there, then also we make each other better. We don't always all agree with each other, and we're not a group that hangs out, but we know that we're all writing, so that's quite special from a project. To be part of Project Syndicate feels quite special, and I think there is this distinction of the lowering of the boundaries of anybody can write, and I've been writing for a while, but then there are different kinds of opinion writers, and you were talking about the hot take and so on. I mean, that's not what I write for Project Syndicate.
Most of the hot take people are young people working for a publication, trying to basically chase the clicks.
Which has a value.
Yeah,
I think it has a value. I mean, it's interesting
some of it has
to
a
get
value.
there. Yeah, I think it, yeah.
But it has one value it has is it pays their salary. Now you're not writing because it pays your salary. So I mean,
No.
so why is having platforms like Project Syndicate or the New York Times op-ed page or some of these other websites, why is that valuable to somebody who's not depending on it for a salary?
Well, for me personally, I find that there, I'm thinking about and trying to create a new paradigm for, in my case, the boardroom and how we conduct business. So the things I write about are business ethics, how we conduct business, as someone who sits in the boardroom and knows that we're at a time of shifting power dynamics and shifting ways of thinking about it, and this is a black box room that people who sit in it don't write about, and we are at a time where there's this conflict between the world outside that room, and we need to face up to the realities of the changing nature of that dynamic and also our responsibilities. So to me it feels important to write about it because it's something that is important to everybody who sits there. The chair that you sit on, whether or not it falls apart, is a decision that somewhere along the line was a boardroom decision about whether or not we cut the costs of how we manufacture the chair and how we conduct business. So for me, I write for Project Syndicate because I hope that people feel as if what I'm writing about is important and is changing the way we think about business and the way we conduct business. And I know that it gets distributed around the world. It gets translated into 12 languages. Yeah. So, I mean, my son likes to click through and, there's mommy in Chinese, there's mommy in Arabic, there's mommy in Dutch, there's mommy in Russian. But what's important about that is that the audience is global, and the feedback that I get is really valuable as well. So, this interaction on social media, I use Twitter a lot, Facebook, LinkedIn, all of these things. And so I hear back from people about what they think, and that's very valuable. Whether they agree or disagree, I want to know. I want to hear from people about
Does
that.
the fact that you're being syndicated around the world and writing for the BBC and doing TV for Roadboard, does that improve your position within the boardroom when you're fighting the battles that you want to fight in there?
Not necessarily. It is not the easiest thing in the world to write something critical about. I'm very careful. It's a very fine line. I never write about the companies that I sit on the board of. I never tweet stories about the industries in which I exist, because people look to board members for indications of things. So you could, tip the stock one way or that. You could do all kinds of things. So it's stressful, but to me it's important. And I write also as a reminder to myself. The kinds of things I'm writing about, it's not just about the boardroom, but I also write about issues that we're facing. I've written about transparency, data protection, data privacy, big data, about the changing nature of industries. Last month I wrote about how the blurring of lines between industries. So I'm writing about sort of what's changing, the causes for those changes, and what the future will be. And I want to start a discussion, which is I think what all of the writers at Project Syndicate, we put things out there to start a discussion, and then our work is then cited by others. And that's good. So, I coined the phrase of grounding and stargazing, which is now a fairly standard phrase in planning and scenario planning and so on, and having a platform to put that concept out there and have people agree or disagree with it, and then to see it become part of the language that people use in business. That's really valuable, but it's not because of ego, though I think you have to have a pretty strong sense of self to put your opinion out there, but also it's because I believe strongly that someone has to speak up about how we change the fundamental ways that we do business. So, it's true that I sit on boards and that I do consulting and writing and speaking, but what's important to me also is sending big ideas out there and having people adopt them and use them.
Does anybody have a another perspective?
Yeah, from our perspective, the editorial board of Project Syndicate, what we view ourselves to some extent as an agenda-setting organization, that we want to sort of point editors to important issues, important themes. These people, these wonderful, eloquent thinkers, have identified something, and hey, maybe that's something that you should pick up on. And sometimes there's cross-pollination between our authors. This recently happened to Lucy. She wrote this piece about the sort of deteriorating boundaries between industries, and then a week later, Mohammed El Arian wrote a similar piece for us on precisely.
You're
this,
welcome, Mohammed.
on precisely this issue. Or, we had last year, quite a series of pieces, 3 or 4 by Shinzo Abe, the Japanese Prime Minister, about changing Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, the so-called Peace Constitution, to allow a more robust sort of military or defensive posture on the part of Japan. And the New York Times then wrote a very long blog post about this change in Japan, citing these articles from these commentaries that Abe wrote for us. So we do view ourselves as sort of, it doesn't always work, obviously, but it often does, that we identify issues, we try to identify issues that we think deserve further coverage. Last year there was a big debate on our site between Bill Gates and Jeffrey Sachs. And it prompted some of our editors in Africa to actually assign reporters to cover these Millennium Development Villages that Sachs had set up in Kenya and various countries. So sometimes opinion can actually influence the reporting agenda. What people think is important as news.
I mean, there's no doubt I get phone calls and emails following up from pieces, and if I hit a topic that, you know, I did something. What was the title? Socrates in Silicon Valley, and
Right.
and it was about how technology companies need to do a lot of self-examination about how they're running themselves, and that they need to realize that they're global businesses, then they need to have global standards of the way they do business, and that, you know, you can't just be a startup and not think about the consequences of data privacy because you're just moving so fast that you don't have time to think about it, and how we have to hold all of these businesses to account. And then that created quite a lot of.
You're actually not doing yourself justice, because there was a gender angle to that piece, which turned out to be very prescient,
Yeah.
right? Because, you know, then we had the Silicon Valley lawsuit, right? And now this issue in Silicon Valley is getting a lot of attention.
Yeah.
The fact that there simply aren't women in high positions in a lot of these companies and venture capital funds.
And then,
so
I mean,
forth.
and they have so the objective then is the piece goes out, and then there have been also the one on FIFA was really got a lot of pickup as well, because I wrote about how FIFA and corporate governance and so on, so the areas that you don't necessarily think about where you need to apply these ideas and scrutiny. But what ended up happening was I got a lot of then queries from the press and so on, and some of them I talked about on background and said, you know, go out and write about it. I mean, I've said my piece, you can quote it if you want to, but what I really want you to do is I want you to write about these issues, because for me, it's not just about me and, you know, isn't it great, but actually I want people to think differently about business. I want them to hold business to a higher standard, and also realize that the barriers are lowering, and that you can ask these hard questions and things will come of it.
Okay. Matt. We've talked about the hot take phenomenon of people writing very quickly to try to chase a trending topic. We've talked about the volume, or about the idea that if you write something that maybe quickly it can take off just as easily as something that you spent hours or days working on. So you are one of these digital natives who kind of live in this world that's red and tooth and claw, and it's competitive, and it's a constant battle for people's attention. Mm-hmm. So the question I have for you is, in that competition of trying to grab eyeballs, what's the relative weight of importance of these following qualities? So quantity versus quality. Is it important to just hit often, or is it important to do it well but very often? I mean, obviously both are important, but what's the weight? And originality of thought versus timeliness. Now, I'm not necessarily talking about finding eternal fame. I'm talking about surviving in the business ecosystem that's there.
That's a really tough question, because those factors are always changing. I mean, it's on any given story that combination will be different. So it's and an hour later it will be different, and 2 hours later it will be different, and the next day it will be different. So it's a constantly, you know, the Venn diagrams with the circles that intersect. The areas where they overlap are going to be different each time. So if it's 10 minutes after something happened, then you need to be first. If it's an hour after things happened, then you should have some analysis. If it's 4 hours after something happened, your analysis had better be pretty good, or you better have something extra. If it's the next day, you have to take a completely different approach. So then you have to have much more analysis, much more.
I just want to highlight the fact that this is an industry that 10 years ago, the next day was very, very fast.
Right.
And now it sounds like it's.
We're talking about minutes. We're talking about minutes in terms of news, for sure. Obviously, there are things that you will always want to take more time with. I'm talking about sort of breaking news. If it's an ongoing issue, then those timelines will be longer, but the same things apply. Once 45 different places have written about it, your job is exponentially harder. Mike Arrington, who founded this site called TechCrunch, I remember he was at a conference that I was involved with, and he said, I love to be first, and the main reason I love to be first is because if you're not first, your job is way harder. So if you're first, all you have to say is, this just happened, or this is happening, or this is going to happen. Anything after that, you have to do exponentially more work. And so you had either better have some insight, or you had better do a better job than anyone else of explaining what happened, or you had better do a better job than anyone else of collecting the opinions that have already been expressed and then saying who's right and who's wrong. You have to pick so quite quickly I discovered, I mean, I was an old-fashioned columnist for a long time. I would just write whatever popped into my head and then go home. Like, that was my job. And so, and it was a great job because I didn't have to worry about what anyone else was writing. I never heard from anyone unless someone phoned the switchboard randomly. So it was, it was great. If you write online, your job is completely different. Everyone is writing about the same thing. You hear from people instantly about all the things you got wrong. And so I think you have to, I realize that there are things fall into several buckets. One is, this just happened and I'm trying to help you understand what happened. Another is, this happened a while ago and a bunch of people have said things about it, and these are the important points that have come out, which used to be, to your point, that used to be the next day's story. So Malik, who started Gig said that I was his favorite sort of next day writer. That quickly became later the same day and a couple of hours later. So, because you didn't have until the next day. Now there are still next day takes, and there are a week from now. One of my favorites is the person who kind of is away for a week, or they're doing something else, or they've been, so they weren't paying attention, but they're very smart and connected, and so they come to the story a few days later and have some insight that hasn't been expressed. It's just harder and harder to do that the more time goes by, because there are a lot of smart people out there, and there are a lot of people who are actually involved in the thing you're writing about. When you were a newspaper columnist, there were 3 other people maybe, if that. And so you had a lot less competition. Now you can be smart and informed and have some great opinion and analysis and be one of about 1,000 people who have the potential to write about that. They can write about it on their own blog, they can put it on LinkedIn, the people who are actually involved in the story can write about it. So you'll have the person who's actually in that news event writing a piece for Medium, or they're putting it on their blog, or it's on LinkedIn or Huffington Post. Those people are all your competition now.
Well, just a thought, which is actually, I mean, first of all, nobody does it better than you. I love reading. No, Matt knows I'm a fan of Matt. I love his work so much, and it's always just the smartest thing to read on any topic. So
It's true.
It's true. It's true. No. I mean, I really love his
can't
work.
deny it.
But one thing he points out actually is a good point, which is the stuff that I write, the different kinds of columns that I write, all of them actually have to be fairly evergreen, because when I write something for Project Syndicate, well, Jonathan doesn't even look at it for 7 days.
Depends when you turn it in.
Yes, I know.
Deadlines.
But also then it has to be evergreen enough to get distributed through the network and to go through translation and so on, and everything takes time. So I'll write something and you might not read it for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month even. And so, because it gets distributed around the world and then it goes into print, and that takes time. And or it goes in, sometimes it goes into magazines. It's, appeared in German magazines and so on. So it needs to hold itself for longer, which means that even if I'm reacting to a news story or I'm being proactive about a news story, it has to be written in a way that it can be read before the news story, once the news has happened, after the news story. I did something about the currency and what needs to happen. I mean, the kinds of things that I'm writing, they just have to be longer. And so you're right, that's part of the pressure, is that it has to be smarter, or,
And actually the best thing about writing online is that you can change things. So if something happens that alters the nature of what you were writing about in a crucial way, you can update whatever you were writing. I used to hate writing a column, and inevitably, after I filed it, 10 minutes later, something would happen that changed the story, and I would think, damn, if only I could put that into what I wrote, or if only I could take account of that because it's super important. And so I wound up actually writing those things on my blog. But online, you can actually incorporate those things, and the story itself can evolve, and your opinion about it can evolve. And I think that's a crucial thing that we need to, old-fashioned columnists like I used to be, you need to come up with a rock-solid opinion that's arguable right now, and then just print it. And then it just lives forever. And that's not how people think, it's not how people behave, it's not how news stories occur and evolve. Stories don't have a beginning and an end and a defined middle and a sort of story arc the way we want them to have. They evolve and they change, and our opinions about them change and should change. And online, you at least get to incorporate some of that, which makes it better to me than this sort of archived, snapshot of an opinion frozen in amber.
So you don't like the things I write?
So I feel like there's something that's getting a little lost here, and maybe it's because we have such an opinion writing panel. But, this is supposed to be about opinion versus the news. And so if I could just drag it back a little bit toward that, I feel like, so I have one thing, I think I only have one thing I really want to say here, which is that at a time when everyone has an opinion and a publishing platform, there's huge value in journalists who report the hell out of a subject and keep themselves out of it.
Definitely.
Absolutely.
So, and when I think back on the great stories of the past, many years, whether it's the NSA story and I that's not just now, but going back to Jim Risen and Eric Lischblau's story that was held too long before it ran. Or the stories from the Washington Post about the Walter Reed Army Hospital and the abuses there, or the Arab Spring, or ISIS hostages, or Watergate for that matter. These are not stories that started out being opinion stories and could not be written. I mean, they could have been written by columnists, but they weren't written by columnists. And so, I just think there's a huge value in that, and we can't let the whole thing drift off.
I totally agree. I totally agree.
I would completely second that. There is no opinion writing worthy of being published without reporting to precede it.
Yeah,
if we don't know what the issues are, and we don't have a credible narrative of what's going on, then no opinion is worth anything.
And there's lots of dumb, there are metric tons of dumb opinions written every day because the person doesn't actually know what the facts are, or they got them wrong. I was just going to mention Seymour Hersh, who a famous investigative reporter who broke the news of the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, gave an interview recently, and he was asked what kind of advice he would give to writers because he's like 100 years old or something, and he said, one of my main pieces of advice is just get the F out of the way of the story.
Yeah.
If you are a reporter, just get out of the way of the story. It is not about you. It is not about sort of what you think. In some cases, it is just about the story, and you need to tell it to the best of your ability, and then opinions can form.
Right.
So I would totally agree.
I think sorry.
And I think
one thought.
just one other thing. Sorry, I do think that as newsrooms, struggle with revenue and with staffing, that the ability to do deep enterprise and investigative work is something that just can't be lost, and that's
Agreed.
true on the local level in particular, and it's actually more of a problem and more of an issue on the local level.
Can I follow up with a quick question on that?
Can I just say one thought, which is, because it is exactly what you were saying, Margaret. A friend of mine worked for months on the story about Starbucks and tax evasion and so on, and that kind of reporting is really expensive, but without it, it might have been something that I had an inkling of from within the boardroom, but I wouldn't have known the scale of it or the implications of it in a larger piece. And then he and I have talked about it, and we've done stuff on it, and I've written about it and the sort of ethics of it. But that sort of reporting, I have a note here to myself, which is there's a spectrum of news through to opinion, and I think that news is a public good. It's a larger discussion, but from an ethical perspective and from a public service perspective, I believe that news is worth investing in, and that it's a public good.
But people don't pay for it.
But that's also why I love the BBC, as an aside, which is because it must be funded in order to have it
People
go
are
out there.
forced to pay for it.
But this is
they
the
want
question. The
to
reason is not it's news versus opinion and not news and opinion is
Right.
because they're competing in this marketplace.
Sure they are.
And in a marketplace where you have to be 10 minutes behind, it's very easy in 10 minutes to come up with an opinion and write it. It's very hard to have that. So I guess the question I have is, absolutely, there's a value. It's not clear that right now we're able to capture that value in the internet marketplace. So what can we do to resist the pressure on news that's coming from this opinion? Because you spend months writing about Walter Reed. I spend 10 minutes saying, hey, look, the New York Times written about Walter Reed, and isn't that a terrible thing? I'm going to cry, and I might get as many hits as you are, right?
More.
I think news organizations have to tell their story better to the public and somehow get across the idea that this kind of reporting that is so valuable to society and democracy takes time and takes effort and is expensive, as Lucy said, and can't be lost. So I think we have to do a better job of getting that message out.
I'm not convinced that, I mean, we can tell people how valuable it is and how much they need it, and if they don't want to pay for it, they won't. I mean, it's not that we see it as valuable. They have to see it as valuable.
But
I don't know how to do that.
But I think part of the issue is we take information for granted. You know, we've all grown up with newspapers. We've all grown up with this sort of, you know, with the New York Times or whatever is local to you, and we just know that information will come. And I don't think there's. I mean, again, with my business hat on, you know, if you're sitting in the boardroom of a news-making organization and you're trying to take decisions about where things go, you know, there has to be some way of saying, even though we're not making money off of this component, it is essential to who we are. And there is this tension in the business model of saying, you know, opinion is useful because it's what distinguishes us from other places, but news is the thing that is our lifeblood, and that's why I think.
But ironically, the fact that it is a public good is why people don't want to pay for it.
But that's why I think you need something like the BBC.
There was
I mean,
an interview.
Does anybody mind if we go to the audience for questions?
There was an interview in which a 20-something-year-old said, "Why would I pay for the news? The news is public. The news is out there. I should just get it."
Well, you know, there are nearly 1 million people right now who are paying for the New York Times with a digital subscription. So I think you know, maybe that's New York Times exceptionalism or something, but I think that people do value the news.
That's just because they want the Sunday paper.
No, I actually subscribe to it
Yes, so
because
do
I
I.
don't want the New York Times to go under. I mean, and if I can do something small to prevent that from happening, you know, paying $15 a month, to me, that's absolutely worth it because it's my homepage. It's where I you know, go in the morning or in the afternoon when I wake up to find out what's important.
But I think that's where the sort of personal aspect comes in. I would much rather pay Seymour Hersh than the New York Times. I would much rather pay an individual who I think is doing something important
But
than
no
an
individual
institution.
can do it all, you know.
But
No individual can be everywhere, you know.
No.
And from my perspective, I have to know what's going on in Australia and Africa and Latin America, you know, and in the tech world, in the auto world. I mean, it's essential to have a high-quality, comprehensive newspaper that I've grown up with and that I trust, and that makes mistakes very often, and I often don't agree with it. And
But what if you didn't grow up with it?
Sorry?
What if you didn't grow up with it?
I think I still think it's public good. If it makes you feel any better, I've made a note, Jonathan. I will submit a column in the next several months. Why news is worth investing in.
I don't think there's any point in writing that column.
I absolutely. Well, it's the point.
I'm not being
but here's-
facetious.
No, I know
don't
you are.
think-
Until you see it.
It's like saying, this is why I think
but
eating
that's
is
why
important.
it's an opinion column. I mean, but that's
Yeah.
the point. It's actually, I think it's worth writing about, and that's the beauty of being an opinion columnist. It's my
And if
opinion.
Jonathan lets it go through, then
Then we're going to see.
More
then we're
power-
going to
more
see
power
it,
to you.
and all of you are going to read it, and you're going to love it, and you're going to become
and
viral, and
I'll
then
have
you're
a
going
hot
to feel
take
bad.
on it within 10 minutes.
Exactly, that's going to be fun, and you were here when it happened. No, I think it's. I mean, we've talked about it. I was on a panel last year, and we talked about it, and I believe that news is a public good, and I think opinion. Not all opinion is a public good. I don't think all opinion is worth reading, but I do think, and I'm not sure all news is worth reading, but I do think that we wouldn't be anywhere without understanding the world. And
But news as a public good is like saying you should eat your vegetables.
You should eat your vegetables.
You should eat vegetables, and you should floss, and lots of
Yes,
people
you should
don't
floss.
because they just don't care.
Yeah, but I don't
Well, then
think
let's
that.
let all the news reporters go away, and opinion guys won't have anything to write about.
Right. No, that's exactly right. And I have to say,
I was a reporter at one point.
I have to say that there is, there's this business angle to it. Writing opinion is just cheaper, and we find that for us that's been kind of a boon because. As print publications in particular around the world lay off staff, they fill up that space with syndicated content,
Sure.
which means they come to us because we give them high quality,
Already edited
high quality syndicated content, and they like it. But we also view ourselves as providing a public good because we operate on a non-commercial basis. No paper anywhere in the world is turned down because they can't pay. We use subscription fees, membership fees from newspapers and publications in the advanced countries, in wealthy countries, to subsidize newspapers in developing countries. And something like 51% of our 500 member newspapers receive our content for subsidized rates or free of charge completely.
I think we're getting off the rails. Can we go to questions?
But the point is that it is we do view ourselves as also providing
Sure.
a public good.
Which is why
right?
actually a lot of us write for you. So, I mean, if
I'm sure BuzzFeed does too.
No, but let me just say this. I mean, because it is an important piece, which is you asked why is it that I write, and if I have a choice of writing for a lot of different places, why is that Rubini and Stiglitz and Tyson and I all write for Project Syndicate? The reason is because we also like the ethos of the fact that we write to be read, and we want to be read, and we don't want to be exclusive to only the places that can afford it. And so my stuff appears all across Africa, all across Latin America, all across everywhere. And because those ideas shouldn't be restricted to just people who can afford to pay for it.
Yeah.
So.
Does anybody have a question? No one?
We've
Anyone?
scared you.
Anyone with opinions?
Nobody has a question. There we go.
We got one. Better.
La devo fare in italiano perché il mio inglese è terrificante. No, volevo chiedere alla signora Margaret del New York Times. Nel film Birdman si attacca, no? Che ha vinto 4 premi Oscar. Mi scusi. Mi scusi, la domanda è collegata al film Birdman, che ha vinto 4 premi Oscar e che fa una forte critica al New York Times e soprattutto alla critica a vantaggio magari di Twitter e dei social. Volevo la sua opinione in merito a questo tipo di informazione che viene data nel film. Grazie.
Is there anybody who needs this? So the question was, I haven't seen Birdman, but apparently in the movie Birdman, there is a critique of Birdman from the New York Times from the social media perspective, and she's asking if Margaret has any opinions on that.
The New York Times is kind of a character in Birdman, in the sense that it can make or break a theater production. And, to me that speaks, criticism, arts criticism is a really important kind of opinion writing that's been around for a long time. I think it's something that has to be wielded with a great deal of responsibility. And I think in general that is true at the New York Times from what I can tell. I've actually talked to the critics who say that they're very cognizant of the fact that they wield a big stick, and particularly with things that can be wrecked with a tough review, that they are very, very aware of that. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's the best I can do, I think.
Does anybody else have a question?
Anything at all?
I think we frightened them.
Wow, I covered it all.
Oh, good.
This question is for you, Mathew. You said that, saying that people should pay for journalism is like people should eat their vegetables and that no one will do it. I wonder if there's a distinction to be made between forms of content and particularly types of content that people will pay for, perhaps that's non-commodifiable. So people might not pay for news because it's all over the place. But for investigative reporting or perhaps certain types of commentary, do you think there's a potential for people to actually pay for that?
I should be clear. I think there's a potential for people to pay for all kinds of things. In some cases, it might be news, particularly hyper-local news. It might be, I mean, The Correspondent is getting people to pay for things that are a form of news, a form of journalism. I'm not saying you can't get people to do it. I'm saying you can't get them to do it by telling them they should do it. You can't tell them you should pay for this because it's really valuable, because that argument doesn't make any sense. Either they see it as valuable or they don't. So what you probably need to do is convince them that it's valuable. And that's a different thing than saying, you know, we've been around for 184 years and we're super valuable and so please pay us. That argument just doesn't function.
I wasn't actually suggesting
No, and
doing that.
I'm not putting words in Margaret's mouth. I'm saying, and I'm
don't.
talking about lots of other newspapers. I'm talking about the traditional media in general. The argument is, you know, we're a big company. We've been doing this a long time. We know what we're doing. It's really valuable. Please pay us. And I don't think that really works for a lot of people. What people want to pay for, I think, is a relationship of some kind with someone or something, with something they believe in. So The Correspondent and a bunch of other places have tapped into that, have made people feel that they are part of something and that what is happening is valuable. That precedes them paying for it. Do you know what I mean? So they have to feel that first, and you have to get them to somehow feel that first. And lots of people feel that about the New York Times. They believe it is valuable, and they value what the paper does, and they want it to continue, and that's great. But proving that or showing that or making people feel that is easier when they're older and they grew up with it and their father read it and everyone they knew read it. It's much harder now. And especially if it's something new, you have to figure out, why would people value it? What is it about it? Not just that you think it's valuable. So then you have to, what is the people you're trying to reach with your news or your commentary or what would they value about it? Is it a relationship with you? Is it a relationship with the entity you work for? And why? Are you giving them something that they can't get somewhere else? It can't just be, you know, we use different words, and it can't just be our pictures are nicer, or, do you know what I mean? You have to figure out what the fundamental value of the thing you have is.
I mean, I suspect we're much closer, actually. I mean, we joke around, but I suspect actually we're much closer than it seems, because, you know, for me, I think there's a value in news, and I know you do as well, and really it's about meeting people where they are. But the one thing that I think we must resist, and I sometimes get pushed into down this road when I'm writing, not by Project Syndicate, but by other outlets, to make my stuff sexier or more, you know, like more tabloidy, or, you know, so I say, I mean, and you know, to the point where I'm like, I feel as if I've lost my voice. I'm chasing a voice that isn't mine, and that I think we have to resist in a way, which is, you still have to stay true to what you do. You still have to know that you need to, that there is a public value in investing in journalism, good, deep journalism, that it isn't always easy to see where the rewards come back immediately from a business perspective. Because I mean, I always think of it from a business perspective. So I think you have to run a good business, but you also have to know that it is worth investing in something that seems like a lost leader, because you need to see return. I mean, we haven't talked about it, but, you know, Stephan is part of a group called Deca, and they do deep writing and come out with just one story a month amongst a collective of writers. And tell me if I'm getting it wrong, but I mean, amongst a collective of writing, and it's, you know, sort of what we would call a long read, a very long read of a deep reporting on one story, and the way that gets paid for is through people buying that piece or subscribing to the service, and there is a value in that, and I think that's worth supporting.
But the hard part is that, you know, news. So this is called opinion versus news. Both opinion and news used to be restricted, right? Yeah. You could only get them through certain channels. Yeah. So if you wanted informed opinion or reported news, there were only a certain number of places you could get it. Now there are a million places you can get it. And the quality level is all over the map, obviously.
Yeah.
But there's an economic principle that says your competition, the competition that matters, is not the thing that's better than you. It's the thing that's good enough for people, for lots of people.
Yeah.
So in terms of news, lots of people are perfectly happy with something they get from Twitter or something somebody reposts on Facebook. And we can say that that's bad. And we can say that those people are dumbing themselves down. That's not going to stop them from doing that, because their level of interest in that thing is this big. And there are any number of sources to get it from. So the competitive landscape is completely different. And you now have to do a lot more work. It used to be enough to just say, I work for this thing with a specific name, and we've been around a long time, and you buy this paper and we deliver it to your house, and that's our value chain. But your job is a lot harder now. You have to prove that the thing you're doing has some value, because there's just so much of it. And lots of it is good enough for people, whether we like it or not.
Strangely, you've walked right back into last month's column on the blurring of lines of industries.
Well, actually, I wonder if we're not living through a media equivalent of a railroad boom. Where everybody is building a railroad.
Yeah.
And some of them aren't going to go anywhere.
Yeah.
A lot of them are going to end up, just being abandoned, and and there will be
And disruption happens.
Consolidation.
And let's be clear about one thing. I firmly believe that having, millions of sources of news and opinion is a good thing.
Yeah.
I believe that we are better off now than we were. That having one or two newspapers with one or two people who had a column and one or two reporters and maybe one person on TV, that was bad. Yeah. That in many cases you got bad news and bad opinions. They just happened to be given a high profile because they had this distribution channel control. We're actually better off now. It's just harder because there's so much more of it, and you have to do the filtering.
And I think, saying that, I think when I look at stuff like Project Syndicate, the piece I wrote and then the piece that Mohammed wrote, we wrote on the same thing. We took slightly different angles of it, and that happens all the time.
Yeah.
But there's a value in that, because then you have people thinking big thoughts about the same issue, which is actually where innovation comes from, I hope.
Yeah, that also happened again just this month. Simon Johnson wrote a piece saying that currency manipulation should be stamped out by free trade agreements. And then another of our columnists, Kamal Dervish, from the Brookings Institution, came in, former economy minister of Turkey, and said, no, this is completely wrong. The IMF and the G20 should be looking at currency manipulation. This shouldn't be, a part of trade agreements. So we get a debate going among ourselves, and maybe that'll overflow. Maybe that'll start getting picked up by other media, and people will say, hey, wait a minute, what issues do belong in free trade agreements and what don't, right?
And I would say that sort of bouncing off each other, whether it's opinion or news reporting, is fundamentally better. We get a better product as news consumers out of that process. It may not look like it always, and it may be messy and chaotic and frustrating, particularly for us journalists, but I think ultimately people are better served. It just doesn't always look that way.
Is there anybody in the audience who disagrees with that? Yeah? Do you want to tell us? No? You have a question?
Sure.
Okay, go ahead.
I speak in Italian, sorry. Okay. Vorrei riuscire a capire cosa succede quando un opinionista ha delle opinioni che sono nettamente divergenti rispetto alle notizie. Io lavoro in campo energetico ambientale e capita spessissimo. Cambiamenti climatici, c'è l'allarme delle Nazioni Unite e c'è chi dice che dopo tutto non sono importanti, ma nel frattempo i ghiacci si sciolgono. Approvvigionamento energetico, c'è chi dice che la Russia non è importante, però chiude i rubinetti. E spessissimo troviamo delle opinioni con delle notizie che sono contrastanti. Ora, questo è naturale, ma Non si può verificare un disorientamento da parte del lettore in base a questo. Su un giornale italiano, a proposito di cambiamenti climatici, è uscito nella stessa pagina un anno fa la notizia dell'allarme del quinto rapporto dell'IPCC, e nella stessa pagina c'era un grande articolo che prendeva l'opinione di uno degli scienziati su 700 dell'IPCC che non era d'accordo con le conclusioni dell'IPCC. Ecco, era molto disorientante come cosa. Grazie.
Anybody?
I think, I mean, this is a problem of this sort of there have to be two sides to every story kind of thing, even if it's a, you know, an overwhelmingly minority view. We have a monthly columnist, Bjorn Lomborg, who wrote a book 10 or 15 years ago called The Skeptical Environmentalist, and he doesn't deny climate change, and he doesn't deny that it's an important issue and that we have to do something about it, but he believes that cutting carbon dioxide emissions, is not the right way to go about it, that it's economically inefficient, and that we can use our scarce resources to do much better things that have much more of an impact. And people dispute his numbers, dispute his data, his methodology. This to me doesn't seem like an opinion, like a line of opinion that is completely sort of beyond the pale, that completely denies science, because he doesn't. He has a different take on it. He believes that we should be investing more in green technology, for example. He thinks that the issue has to be addressed, but the whole thrust of the international community's policy toward this is cutting carbon emissions, and he fundamentally disagrees with that. Now, I disagree with him, but do I think that viewpoint that he expresses is valuable? Yes, I do, and I think that it's something that people should become acquainted with, and they should evaluate it on its own terms, and draw a conclusion.
Did you want to say something?
Yes. On your topic, one of the things that can happen in a straight news story is the statement of what the science agrees on. We don't have to, yes, we can, give voice, I suppose, to different points of view, but when some of the points of view are saying things that just aren't backed up by the science, the reporter in his own voice, without saying, I think so, can simply state, what the science now agrees on. And to do anything other than that is what, a lot of us refer to as false balance or false equivalency. You don't have to have, 50% of this and 50% of that if this part is wrong. So, I think it's really important to state the truth. It doesn't have to be stated as opinion. It can be stated as the accepted truth on a particular matter, whether it's climate change or creationism versus evolution, or voting rights, and whether a voting ID is necessary to inhibit fraud. Well, there is no fraud. Right. So, it's a political statement. You have to point it out, and it can be done very validly within a news story.
I think it's too bad when newspapers engage in clickbait like that, because newspapers invented clickbait. They invented the story or the column that takes a contrary opinion, and because they want people to read newspapers. And often you will find, particularly columnists, that will be run in newspapers because they're spouting some completely nonsensical opinion, because someone somewhere will find it, either they will hate it so much they will hate read it, or they will love it so much that they will love read it. But either way, they will read it.
And as someone who writes opinion, I don't mind saying something controversial, but I don't want people to hate and read me.
I don't care as long as they read it.
No, I think there are plenty of people who disagree with the things that I write, but again, that's why I go back to the point that it's not the truth, but it's my truth, and I'm happy for people to argue against it, as long as we're arguing based not just on sort of fingertip feel, but having some fact in it. And so, I try to write backed up by fact, and though a lot of what I write is feeling, it's also, I can point to the breadcrumbs that brought me to that place, so you can see where my thinking came from, and it's not just magical thinking.
I don't think we should have this panel go by without quoting Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who said, "You're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts."
Right.
I was gonna
Exactly.
quote Nietzsche, who said, "There are no facts, only opinions."
So I believe we have time for one more question. I think it's a credit to the panelists that you guys are all still sitting in your seats because it's been a long time.
But it has to be really, really good.
This has to be the best question of the night.
Best question ever.
No pressure.
Here it comes.
Okay, maybe I can sit. I wanted to ask you one kind of question, like a communication student from Lithuania. I don't know, we are always suggesting with my course mate how to write a good critical news. Because now there is quite popular to write your opinion in a critic way, for making a critics for politics, for the parliament. And my question is how to write your opinion in that way that you wouldn't start to write the critical news in an angry, impolite way. How to not lose the quality of the news and not to start to be unpolite and angry. Thank you.
I think you can do that. I think if you keep a moderate tone and try to stay factual and reasonably respectful, it may not amount to a hot take, but it could be a better piece.
I think I don't know I can't remember the writer's name, but there was a Gawker writer who wrote very, very critically about someone. I think it was the woman who posted a sort of vaguely racist tweet and then got on the airplane to go to South Africa, and he triggered this sort of, this made
Avalanche
this
of
woman's
hate.
life
Yeah.
miserable.
By the time
basically,
she landed, she was fired.
yeah, fired, and then she spent like a year in Africa working with the disabled or something, or the poor, just to make up for this single tweet. And he wrote something later in which he basically said he felt horrible that because he wrote a typical kind of hot take on this incident and how this person was clearly racist and just the worst possible person. But he had no idea of what he had unleashed and what it would do to her and her life and so on. He met her later. I think you have to think about, and this was brought home to me a number of times when I was a columnist and since I started writing online, you have to think about the impact of what you're writing. It's not just, those words aren't just going out into the ether and they're just going to float around. And if you're writing about people, it will have an impact on them, and it might not be nice, and you might be the trigger of that. And it's fine to work yourself up into a lather about some issue, but there are often human beings involved, and you need to consider that.
Yeah. I mean, that's actually something I take very seriously, because the stuff I write about, I'm writing about my peers, my colleagues, people I even may know. I tend to stay away from, Bob is the worst guy in the world for doing this, and I tend to be more issues oriented. But that's the kind of writing I do, and I'm very careful about that, because Bill, I have feelings, and I mean, unless someone does something absolutely criminal and horrendous, we're dealing with gray. There's black and white is hard to find.
I mean, I agree with Margaret that you have to be, sort of stick to the facts. I think that you can be very critical of an organization or even a person, and do it fairly, without. I mean, we just put out a piece by Jeff Sachs on ExxonMobil's Arctic oil and gas drilling policy, and he's extremely critical of it. And the CEO of ExxonMobil wrote a report for the National Petroleum Industry, the trade association of all of the big oil companies, basically defending Arctic oil drilling and saying, let's go ahead and do it. And Jeff Sachs really took him to task and named him, called him out by name, and was extremely critical of it. But it wasn't ad hominem at all. He was attacking this idea, this policy, this sort of head in the sand stance that ExxonMobil has taken, completely denying any negative adverse consequences of Arctic oil and gas drilling. To me, that's a completely fair piece to write.
Okay, I want to thank our panelists, Margaret Sullivan of the New York Times, Jonathan Stein of Project Syndicate, Lucy Marcus of Project Syndicate and many other, and Mathew Ingram of Fortune.
Fortune. And can I just say one thing, by the way? I also want to thank because this is one of my favorite events of the year to come to at any time. I mean, I really make time to go to it because, you know, Christopher and Ariana and the entire team, all the volunteers, all the translators.
All the volunteers,
I'm
translators.
so sorry I talk so fast.
2 thumbs up.
And so, and all of you, I mean,
Thank you so much.
It's such an exceptional gathering, and you won't find this kind of conversation in many other places. So just thanks from all of us to all of you and all of you for all the hard work to get us out of the room on time. And thanks.